Glenn is an ugly, lonely loser who specializes in healing lustful, beautiful monster girls. Using very intimate, freaky treatment methods, he is able to heal and also give his patients ecstasy, which makes them fall in love with him and always leaves them craving him and wanting more. He turns from a total lonely, ugly loser into a sexy doctor who kinky monster girls want to clap and sleep with him all day and night. This anime alchemist recap brings us on his kinky journey and how Glenn develops his harem. In this world, humans and monsters were at war for generations, until they were finally able to put aside their differences and achieve peace, and create a world where humans and monsters coexist. In the present, a young lonely human doctor. He uses freaky, sexy, intimate methods to treat the girls, leaving them hungry for even more of him. He turns from a total lonely loser into a sexy doctor who girls want to clap and sleep with him all day and night. Our story starts with Glenn in his clinic. In the present, Glenn is treating one of his freaky patients, and he goes on to fondle her giant melon cannons, which escapes the bondage of the little strings of clothes holding it. He does a full melon exam and makes her feel all tingly. Then he discovers no lumps in her cannons and proceeds to check her ears. While she begins to make happy noises, she tells him that her ears are sensitive and that it is turning her on. Having finished the intimate examination and getting out of the examination room, Glenn's assistants, who are fairies, immediately wipe his hands to get rid of any creamy juices from the girl. Then a patient named Cirsa asks Glenn what her illness is, and when he tells her, she gets excited. Also, her husband comes in without knowing how satisfying the examination went.
Oh my!
Meanwhile, Glenn's assistant, who is a snake monster and also a freaky and beautiful nurse named Saphantite Nikes, comes in to give Cirsa and her husband a bouquet of flowers to congratulate them on their pregnancy. Later that evening, while the fairies clean the clinic, Safi stylishly tells Glenn how she feels uncomfortable about him staying alone in a room with a married woman, while she makes happy, sexy noises. Immediately, Glenn apologizes and he tells her that he had focused on the examination he was conducting, rather than the happy noises. Suddenly, they both hear a knock on the door, and when they check, they realize it is a delivery for them from Dr. Tlilie, who is also Glenn's mentor. While in a carriage to where Dr. Tlilie had instructed them to go, Safi begins to tell Glenn of how selfish she thinks Tlilie is, but he tells her that the central hospital needs more people to assist in treating the monsters, and he also wants to assist her as a way to repay her for teaching him all he knows about monster medicine. In addition, he tells her he is able to open his own clinic because of the doctor, which Safi tells him she quite understands. Then, Glenn tells her that he would be able to gain more experience and level up as he examines more patients. However, Safi tells him they would be examining warriors and fighters, which means they have a higher chance of seeing unique cases. On getting to the arena, the guard who helps them with their loads suddenly tells Glenn that he should do everything he can to please help their princess when examining her. Hearing this, Glenn and Safi become surprised, but are interrupted by an hyperactive active voice. There, Glenn and Safi meet Tlilie, who welcomes them to the arena, and Glenn introduces himself as the doctor who was sent from the central hospital. Meanwhile, the other monsters begin to talk within themselves that the monster doctor sent to them is a human, but Tlilie shuts them up by telling them not to be rude to Glenn and his assistant. Seeing this, Safi asks Tlilie if she commands the people in such a manner, and she replies that they all listen to her because of her credentials. Suddenly, Tlilie bounces her giant cannons.
Did you pray today?
Making Glenn shocked. But then, she immediately apologizes by telling him she only wanted him to see the badge in between her melons. Seeing this, Safi becomes angry, while Tlilie continues to tell them that she is the only heiress to the Scythia transportation of the town. Suddenly, after telling him about herself, Tlilie begins to laugh like she has successfully boasted of her accomplishments. At that moment, Glenn remembers what the guard told him about their princess, which makes him conclude that Tlilie is the princess being referred to. Soon, Glenn begins to examine the patients, but as he finishes with the patient, she immediately jumps on his lap, which, when Safi sees this, she immediately uses her tail to separate Glenn from the patient. Then the next patient comes in, and it happens to be Tlilie, who begins to undress so as to be examined. On seeing this, Safi begins to get angry, but decides to keep quiet. However, Tlilie begins to tell Glenn of how she is expected to get married and have children as the heiress of her family. Then she adds that she is still searching for the perfect candidate. Also, she tells Glenn, who is not paying much attention to her, that she would love to marry an intelligent doctor. Suddenly, on hearing this, Safi wraps her tail around Tlilie and tells that her waist measurement has increased. Then, she adds that Glenn would need more years before he gets married because he is a doctor. Later that day, Safi tells Glenn of how they were able to finish early, but Glenn tells her it was due to Tlisie's leadership, and he has to go thank her. Immediately, Safi discourages Glenn not to go and thanks her. Suddenly, the two attendants that follow Tlilie, named Kay and Lorna, come to meet Glenn to ask how Tlilie's examination went. There, they also tell him of how Tlilie has been losing her battles, which they think might be as a result of some sort of illness. Later that night, while Glenn thinks of how he would treat Tlilie, Safi comes in to tell him to go to bed, but he tells her he is thinking about Tlilie. At that moment, they flash back to remembering how they had been childhood friends, but Safi tells him that she was his senior back at the academy. However, Glenn tells her he really wants to help Tlilie as Lorna and Kay had called him to tell him that Tlilie also lost her challenge that night. Then, Safi tells Glenn if they should drink some adult grape juice, trying to seduce Glenn and get him into her bed. Soon, Safi brings the drink, but shocks Glenn as she uses ice, and she assures him to get more if it finishes. But as he tastes the grape juice, he notices that Safi is also taking a drink, and when he smells it, he realizes that the alcohol is stronger than his own, and she is trying to get into his pants. Glenn tells Safi he would like her to follow him somewhere the following morning. On hearing this, she begins to wrap her tail around him, touching him all over, as she asks if he is telling her to follow him to go and see a lady. Then she begins to get angry as she tightens her grip, making Glenn know at that moment that he fucked up, but he explains to her that he is only going to treat Tlilie. However, he manages to calm her down and tells her to stop drinking too much, which immediately makes her become the sweetest person ever. The following morning, Tlilie loses another match, and when she goes alone to practice harder, Glenn goes to meet her and tells her that the problem with her is because of her hooves. In addition, he tells her they would have to trim her hooves and get her new good horseshoes. Hearing this, Tlilie becomes a scaredy cat, but Kay and Lorna hold her down while Glenn goes in between her legs to trim her hooves. Then Tlilie tells Glenn to be careful as her legs are very sensitive, which he replies by telling her he would be gentle. At that moment, Glenn puts the gored shoes on her leg, which makes her begin to make happy noises, and also becomes scared as she realizes that Glenn is going to put nails on her leg. Seeing how scared Tlilie is, Safi immediately uses her tail to hold her down, and also keeps her quiet by putting the remaining part of the tail in her mouth like the good little girl she is. The next day, Tlilie continues her fights in the arena, and she is able to go on a winning streak because of her new shoes and because of Glenn. However, Glenn and Safi talks about Dr. Tlilie, and Glenn tells her that the doctor likes to listen to her patients, while she might be testing them to know their strength. However, Tlilie wins her fights, and as Glenn goes to greet her, Safi becomes angry and wraps her tail around him, warning him not to stare at her. Later during the day, Safi remembers how she was taken to Glenn's house as a hostage during the war between the monsters and humans. When the war ended, Safi was taken back home as there was no reason for her to stay in the human's house, and as she leaves in a carriage, Glenn begins to cry as he is going to miss her. A few years later, he got enrolled into Nimia Academy, where he was surprised to see Safi. Back to the present day, Safi realizes they have run out of purified water, but gets interrupted by a knock on the door, and when she answers, Glenn comes in to ask her if she has run out of her sunblock ointment. Later, while the two sit in a boat and ride along the waterways, Glenn discusses how sunblock ointment is important to Safi, which makes her thank him for looking out for her. Meanwhile, Safi is excited as she gets to go out with Glenn.
Wait a minute!
Soon the person paddling the boat bids them goodbye, and Glenn reminds Safi that they should focus on the purified water they have come to buy, as they are not going to buy anything extra. Suddenly, a funny-looking merman comes out of the water and welcomes the two doctors to the merrow waterways, which makes Safi very excited. Then she tells the merman to take them to the gift shop, but Glenn immediately interrupts her and tells the man to take them to the shop where they would get the purified water instead. After getting the water, Safi tells the merman to take them to the gift shop, which makes Glenn stare at her as he tells her they would end up spending more money.
My disappointment is immeasurable, and my day is ruined.
On getting to the gift shop, Safi becomes excited after getting just one glass, and tells Glenn that the best gift she has is to follow him on the journey, which makes him blush a little. Then the merman tells the two about a mermaid show, but Glenn tells Safi that they should just head home. But on their way, a little mermaid calls their attention by calling them, which makes Safi very excited, and tells Glenn that they should stop and listen to her.
Yep.
There, the little girl introduces herself as Lulala and tells them that she sings, but her songs cost 3 coopers. Meanwhile, while Safi and Lulala discuss, Glenn becomes distracted as he begins to think about something else, until Safi calls his attention by licking his face and tells him that he has the nerve to look at a little mermaid in such manner. However, Lulala convinces the two that their relationship would be lovely if they listened to her song, and when Safi tries to pay for the song, Glenn shows off his Betts-like charm and tells her not to worry about it as he would take care of it. He pays for the song and Lulala begins to sing for them. She sings so beautifully until all of a sudden, she begins to cough hard, and they wonder what is wrong with her. Then, Lulala assures them she would continue the song for free, but Glenn tells her that they need to figure out what is wrong with her, because they are monster doctors fanfare. To do this, Glenn tells the funny-looking merman to take them to a silent place so as to examine Lulala. On getting there, Lulala explains how she does not have any money for an examination, but Glenn assures her that it is free. To start with, Glenn takes out a mirror to check her mouth, and when he does, he sees some inflammation in it, and he tells her to open her chest for him to see.
Wait a minute!
Hearing this, Lulala becomes embarrassed, as she tells him she would not be able to do that. Seeing this, Safi immediately corrects Glenn to rephrase his question. Then, Glenn is able to check her vitals, and also decides to check her gills, where he notices something different, and asks if it is okay to touch them, and she agrees. Glenn makes his fingers wet, and dips them into Lulala's gills, making her feel uncomfortable as she begins to make happy sounds. Then Glenn removes his hand and discovers something sticky in her gills. However, Glenn is able to know what is wrong with Lulala, and tries to tell her after the examination, but suddenly, they hear a huge noise as a young boy has fallen inside the river, while the mother screams to be helped. Seeing this, Lulala immediately jumps into the river to save the boy, and brings him back to the shore where she sees Glenn, Safi, and the boy's mother. Unfortunately, while they tend to the boy, Lulala becomes weak and suddenly slides into the water unconscious. As the boy wakes up, Glenn suddenly realizes that Lulala is gone, and remembers that she is not able to switch between her lungs and her gills while on land or inside the water. To save her, Glenn takes in more air and immediately jumps into the water, scaring Safi, who tells the merman to take her closer to where Glenn had entered. Meanwhile, under the water, Glenn sees Lulala and immediately catches up with her before she drowns. Then he kisses her to put air in her through her mouth, and when her gills starts to work underwater, Glenn begins to lose his own consciousness, and before Lulala is able to do anything, she sees Safi's tail in the water. Fortunately, Safi carries the two from the water, and when she sees Glenn holding on to Lulala, she immediately separates them as she scolds him for jumping into the water without telling her.
Emotional damage!
As she also tells him to consider how she feels at times before he makes drastic actions. Later, Glenn and Safi goes to watch Lulala sing at the mermaid concert, which when she finishes, she swims to meet them and they ask her about her health, but she becomes shy as she remembers what Glenn did to save her life. Seeing this, Safi scolds Glenn again and he apologizes to Lulala, but she thanks him for saving her life instead. However, Glenn smiles at Lulala while he looks like a demigod, but she gets shy and swims away, making Safi tell Glenn that she wants Lulala and him to be on good terms, because she considers her as a little sister. Back at their clinic, Glenn and Safi treats a slime lady and talk to her about how they would bell her to retain her form. Soon, she bids them goodbye as she leaves while being carried out in a bathtub. Meanwhile, as Glenn and Safi goes back into rest, Safi removes the sign that they are available for giving treatment so as for them to have some privacy. Suddenly, they hear a knock on the door, and when they open it, they are shocked to see the council representative of Lindworm City named Lady Skady Dragonfeld. When Glenn asks Skady what she wants, she replies to him, but he is unable to hear a word that she said. Then, just when he strains to hear her, a lady suddenly comes in and immediately translates what Skady had said, which is if they are at the right place. However, Glenn replies, and the lady, who came and introduces herself as Kunai now, Skady's bodyguard. Then suddenly, she yells at the doctors to listen carefully, as she would be translating what Skady tells them. At that moment, Safi tells Glenn that she has heard that Kunai is very devoted to her master, but suddenly, she gets shut up by Kunai, who tells them that she lost her arm while battling bandits who wanted to take a day age of her, but she kicked their dumb asses. Therefore, what they are meant to do is to find the missing arm and fix Kunai up. Hearing this, Glenn asks Kunai why they have come to his clinic, which she replies by telling him they were referred to him from Dr. Tlilie. However, Glenn proceeds to ask Kunai the kind of monster she is, but before she could reply, Skady tells them that Kunai is not originally a monster but a human, who was turned into a monster by stitching the bodies of many dead people to form her. Also, she adds that because of this, Kunai hates doctors.
Emotional damage!
Then, as Skady leaves, she tells Glenn to make sure he treat Kunai. But Kunai does not seem to be comfortable with this, and tells Glenn that she does not want him to treat her, as she would look for her arm herself and attach it to, because she has her other arm. Kunai, after seeing that Skady has gone, she immediately leaves the clinic to fix herself, as a result of her degree in medicine and surgery. Meanwhile, Glenn and Safi begins to talk about Kunai and how aggressive she is, but Glenn tells Safi that the doctor who used her as an experiment lacked the necessary technique. However, Glenn packs up to go in search of Kunai's arm, by leaving Safi and the fairies to be in charge of the clinic while he is gone. On the other hand, Kunai goes into the city and suddenly spots one of the bandits that attacked her and chases him into a street. But while she is not looking, she gets hit and she falls down.
My disappointment is immeasurable, and my day is ruined.
However, in the city, Glenn begins to look for Kunai's leg, but begins to regret that he did not ask for where she fought the bandit. While he thinks, he suddenly hears a loud scream, and when he gets there, he sees Tlilie. There, Tlilie tells him she came to the market to shop for vegetables without Lorna and Kay, and suddenly, she shows him Kunai's leg. Seeing this, Glenn carries the leg and realizes that it is for Kunai, and assures Tlilie that it is not a murder, but Kunai's leg. Surprisingly for him, Tlilie knows Kunai. Meanwhile, on the street, Kunai drags herself on the floor, as she begins to regret how careless she is to lose her arm and her leg. Then she tells herself she needs to find her missing parts, so as to get back to work, or else she would not be able to face her master, Skady. While talking, she suddenly begins to make happy noises, and is surprised because her thigh is shaking, which makes her wonder who is feeling her leg to make it tickle her. On the other hand, Glenn holds Kunai's legs while he listens to her story from Tlilie. But while he listens, he observes the stitches on the leg and begins to wonder if her body parts have a mind of their own. Looking at Glenn, Tlilie is amazed by the way he is doing his job diligently. Surprisingly, she tells him she has fallen for him.
Oh my god! Wow!
But adds that he looks like a perverted person with the way he is fondling that sexy zombie leg. Hearing this, Glenn realizes he has f***ed up and implores her not to mention this to Safi for him not be doomed. Meanwhile, on the other hand, Kunai tells herself that she knows Glenn is the one touching her leg like that, but she begins to wonder when her curse would leave her alone, as she is able to hear the voices of the souls that their bodies were used in making her. After taking the leg, Glenn wonders where Kunai is, as she is not supposed to go far with her condition. Suddenly, while he thinks about this, he hears a familiar voice calling out to him, and when he checks, he sees Lulala, who tells him what she heard about him, which is that he is gathering body parts to make an experiment. Hearing this, Glenn immediately explains to her that the body is part of his patient. Lulala tells him that she is aware of that, but she has something to give him. Suddenly, she goes underwater, and when she reveals what she wants to show Glenn, he becomes very surprised to see that it is Kunai's arm, which he has been looking for. Seeing this, he thanks Lulala, as he collects the arm and cleans it, without knowing that Kunai is feeling him rubbing her arm. Then, Glenn tells Lulala of his problem of finding Kunai, and she tells him to ask her arm and leg. Later that evening, Glenn finds Kunai and begins to fix her arm while he tries to talk to her to make her calm. They both exchange more things about each other, which makes Kunai begin to feel calm.
Wait a minute!
After fixing her arm, Glenn proceeds to fix her leg, making her begin to make happy noises as the needle goes in and out of her. Meanwhile, Safi receives a visitor who happens to be her drinking buddy. However, before the visitor leaves, she gives Safi a gift and tells her she is scared Glenn is cheating on her somewhere, and she might not be aware of this. Hearing this, Safi chases the big spider lady out and begins to think on her own. Meanwhile, Glenn has finished treating Kunai, who is embarrassed and leaves after telling him thanks. On getting home, Glenn feeds the fairies, and when he sees Safi, he realizes that her stomach has swollen, which makes her inform him that she is now pregnant. Likely due to the constant nighttime she is having off-screen with Glenn. Wondering how Safi gets pregnant, Glenn tells her she is oviparous and cannot be pregnant. Then, when he asks to see what is under her cloth, she tells him he is being kinky and nasty, and reveals a small basket under her cloth, which they open and finds an egg inside. She explains to him that her friend had given it to her as a gift, but when he observes the egg, he tells her it is unfertilized as it is also owned by a female harpy. At that moment, Safi sees some people outside their house, which the fairies come to warn them about. Suddenly, before the people could attack them, Safi uses her strong tail to knock one of them out, so as to make a way for them to be able to escape. As they run, Glenn thanks Safi and asks why they are after them, to which she replies that those men must have thought that he was working with Kunai when they were seen together. After running for a while, Safi explains to Glenn that those people wanted to take him as a hostage, but she becomes fierce and adds that she would not allow it. While they talk, Kunai suddenly shows up from the dark and tells them that the people who tried to attack them were the slavers she is after, as they are legally trafficking harpies and sell them off to humans with unquestionable taste.
Wait a minute!
Then they present the egg to Kunai, who tells them they would have to follow her so as to be safe, because they do not have enough soldiers to protect them. Hearing this, Glenn and Safi follows her, and on getting to the waterways, they realizes that Lulala is the one driving the boat, and when Glenn asks, Kunai tells him that she would explain on their way. While on the boat, Safi asks Skady why Lulala is on the mission with them, and Kunai explains what Skady says, stating that it is a deal because she was given permission to sing at the Central Council. Hearing this, Glenn tells Skady that she is taking advantage of Lulala's poverty, making Kunai yell at him for talking to her master that way, which also makes Glenn yells at her back that he was not talking to her but Skady. Seeing this, Skady accepts Glenn's accusation and explains why it is so, but Lulala interrupts them and tells Glenn not to worry about her as she is only trying to make a living, and has been given the permission to run away if anything bad happens. Hearing Lulala say this, Glenn becomes relaxed and soon, Kunai begins to tell them of the kidnapper's hideout, which makes Safi tell Skady that their lives are not meant to be out in danger. Then, Skady says something, which Kunai does not translate, but Glenn thinks she is sorry for the trouble she made them go through. At the moment, Lulala announces that they will soon reach their destination, and suddenly, they see some of the bandits, who begin to shoot arrows at them. During this, Kunai takes some of the arrows with her arm, and when Glenn tells her to be careful, she tells him she does not feel any pain. All of a sudden, they hear a loud laughter and see Tlilie walking towards the bandits. She tells Glenn of how she went to the clinic to see him, in order to set a date for their betrothal. At that moment, Kay and Morning immediately attack the bandits and tell Kunai and the rest to leave. And as they do so, Glenn thanks Tlilie while Safi tells her she is being delusional about marrying Glenn. Just as they leave, one of the bandits insults Tlilie by telling her that humans and monsters are not meant to live together, but she hits the bandit as he tries to attack her. Meanwhile, Kunai and the rest get out of the boat and tell Lulala to go, which she did. But as they are about to enter the hideout, they suddenly see the head of the slavers, and while Kunai begins to fight with him, the rest go inside as they follow Skady. There, the leader of the slavers tells Kunai that she is a failure, as she is supposed to protect Skady. But she tells him that Skady is stronger than she is, and besides they have the patrols who have infiltrated the hideout already. At the hideout, Skady and the rest see a door as soon as they enter, and when Glenn opens it, he sees some female harpies and tells them to be calm. Then the female harpies tells him that one of them is hurt, as she has been complaining that her stomach hurts. Seeing this as his special area, Glenn immediately tells Safi to get him a lamp. Then he begins to examine the harpy, only for him to realize that her egg is stuck, which makes him immediately tells Safi and Skady to watch out for the bandits while he treats the harpy. To treat the harpy, Glenn takes off her underwear and begins to treat her. Suddenly, Safi senses some bandits. As they break in, Safi and Skady begin to defeat the bandits. While they fight the bandits, Safi starts to say within herself that she is hiding something from Glenn. She adds that she has an incurable disease of loving him. But her lineage is known for their knowledge in poisons and assassination techniques. Also, Safi remembers how her mother had told her to poison Glenn and his family if their contract did not work out, but she is happy that she did not poison them because the contract went well. Suddenly, Safi begins to feel weird and notices she has been stabbed with a poisonous knife. Immediately, she falls unconscious, But before she goes into a deep sleep, she watches how wonderful Glenn is. The following morning, Safi wakes up to see Glenn, who tells her she is okay, as the poison did not have much effect on her. However, Glenn tells her that the harpy was able to lay her egg, which makes her very happy. But then, she tries to tell him of her greatest secret, but he tells her he is aware of everything she is about to say. Hearing this, she feels calm and excited because she has been holding on to herself all this while. Out of excitement, she begins to undress as she pins Glenn to the bed and tries to work out with him. However, he tells her not to do anything because it would hinder her from working in his clinic if Dr. Tlilie finds out. Hearing this, Safi tells him she doesn't care, but as she is about to kiss him, she suddenly starts to feel weak, which makes him tell her not to stress herself, as the poison is not out of her body yet. Minutes later, Safi becomes embarrassed of what she did, and Glenn tells her not to worry about it. But before she sleeps, she tells him to hold on to her tail till she falls asleep. However, having left the hideout, Glenn and Safi are sent to the harpies' village, while Tlilie tells them she also has a business to discuss in the harpies' village as well, and volunteers to transport their carriage to the village. Kay and Lorna try to help their master, but she tells them she wants to do it herself, so as to prove to Glenn that she is strong and hardworking. Sus dog meme. Meanwhile, Glenn tells Safi that he would love to see Illy, the girl he saved the previous time, but she tells him that Dr. Tlilie informed them that she is losing her feathers and can no longer fly. There, Kay and Lorna decide to help Tlilie by helping her to push the carriage from the back. Suddenly, they hear a huge noise from the mountains and quickly go to help her, as a huge boulder tries to fall on her. Having heard the sound too, Glenn and Safi immediately go to check what is going on, and as they get there, they'd find Tlilie and Lorna in good condition, except Kay. Soon, they see some harpies, and Glenn asks for their help to carry Kay to the village as she is unable to walk. On getting there, they meet with the village elder, who tells them they have a temporary clinic set aside for them. There, Glenn puts Kay on a bed rest and tells Lorna and Tlilie to be okay without her. Soon, Glenn and Safi begins to treat the harpies, and while they do this, the harpies he saved from the slavers come to thank him, which gets Safi angry. Later in the day, Glenn takes a walk around the village and suddenly sees Lorna, who is standing alone. When he gets to her to ask what happened, she begins to tell him how empty she feels without Kay. Soon, Tlilie comes and tells Lorna that she has been looking for her. Later that night, Tlilie goes to join Glenn and Safi while eating. There she explains to them how Lorna has been distracted ever since Kay got injured, and that she has not eaten any good food since. Worried, Tlilie tells Glenn to examine Lorna, but he assures her nothing is wrong with her. At that moment, Tlilie decides to offer Safi a good bottle of grape juice to drink, which makes her tell Glenn they would treat Lorna. That night, Safi and Glenn discuss how they would treat Lorna. The following day, they do a form of therapy on Lorna by blindfolding and tying her down.
It's about to go down.
Then, Glenn asks her to be calm and channel all of her worries to the blindfolding and pain, and she immediately tells Glenn how she feels better with the way she is. Glenn tells Safi that Lorna is able to be treated in such a special way because of her personality and interests. Tlilie thanks Glenn, but later that afternoon when Glenn goes to check Kay, he becomes trapped and admits Kay and Lorna, as they tell him that they want to thank him with their bodies because he would soon be married to their princess and he would have all rights over them. Glenn becomes confused as they place his head in between their average-sized melons, but he tries as much to thank them for their gestures while he refuses politely. Glenn tells Kay that she can now walk as she is getting better, then Safi tells him that their last patient is Illy, but she has been rejecting an examination, and she also requested to see Tlilie in exchange for the examination. Tlilie follows Glenn and Safi to go and look silly, but on getting there, they see that all of her feathers have almost fallen out as she wraps herself with a cloth. Glenn reintroduces himself to Illy, and she tells him that she knows, but he tries to talk to her, while Safi and Tlilie help to clean the room filled with feathers. Glenn checks her feathers and he checks her temperature as well, but this makes her hysterical as his hands are too cold for her hot-blooded body. Safi immediately uses her tail to squeeze Glenn, and she tells him that he should be gentle with younger patients. Tlilie warns Safi, and when she releases him, Illy asks him what her sickness is and he tells her that she is okay as she is only molting. Illy disagrees and she tries to hit Glenn with her talon as she calls him a quack. Tlilie blocks her attack and tells her to apologize to Glenn, but she ignores it and runs away. Tlilie decides to go and meet Illy, and when she sees her, Illy tells her that she wants to be a gladiator, and they both agree to have a duel so as to find out if Illy would make a good gladiator. They fight, and in the end, Tlilie defeats Illy, but Illy uses her talent to scratch her face before turning off in shame.
Emotional damage!
Tlilie goes back to meet Glenn and Safi, and she explains all that has happened to them, and Glenn helps her to treat her cut. Tlilie tells them that she knows Illy is not making any effort to fit in, and she would flee from the village once she is done molting. Tlilie also gives Glenn a feather she left and tells him that it should help with his observation. Then Glenn tells Safi and Tlilie that they would go on a special type of adventure the following day. The next day, Glenn and the ladies begins to pick feathers that belongs to Illy, but while Glenn picks them, Tlilie begins to talk to him, and they discuss, but Safi sees this, and she begins to get jealous as she brings a huge basket filled with feathers, but Glenn tells her that she has packed more feathers. The two ladies begins to argue and stylishly fight about who is more useful to Glenn. Safi begins to cough while she leaves, but Tlilie tells Glenn that he should pay much attention to Safi because of the harsh weather. One of the men in the village suddenly comes to tell Glenn that Illy is missing from the village, and Glenn begins to wonder what is really wrong with Illy as he is not able to figure it out yet. Meanwhile, Illy begins to remember how much she loves flying as she is able to go to wherever she wishes to go, but she decides to try to fly as she thinks she is weak. She stands on a tree and tries to fall to see if she would be able to fly again. Glenn and Safi, including Tlilie, begins to look for Illy, and it is late, but Safi immediately sees her and tells Glenn. They don't go to meet her, and on getting there, Illy insults Glenn for not knowing what is wrong with her, but as she hears how Glenn apologizes to her, she becomes calm and he tells her that his diagnosis is wrong as he just found out what is wrong with her. Glenn tells Illy that she is related to the phoenix bird, and because she is getting to the adult stage, whereby her feathers would grow beautiful colors, her molting stage is getting the best of her. Glenn talks to Illy about her relation with the legendary bird, but unknown to him. Dr. Tlilie tells Skady and Kunai that she intentionally sent Glenn and Safi to tackle with Illy as they are expected to learn more, just like they were in the academy. Few days later, Illy grows beautiful wings and she is able to fly again, but she apologizes to Glenn for being harsh, and she becomes excited to show everyone in the village her beautiful feathers. Glenn suddenly asks Illy why she did not want to be examined at first, and she tells him that she was ashamed as he had seen her lay her egg. Illy goes to meet her friends while Safi and Tlilie meets Glenn to discuss how Illy is meant to know more about herself and her ancestry. Illy flies off and a feather drops from her wings, but as Glenn tries to hold it, it becomes too hot for him to hold and he immediately drops it. But when the ladies ask him what is wrong, he tells them that it is nothing, but he begins to wonder if Ilky has also acquired the flames of the legendary phoenix bird. Glenn begins to demonstrate to the girls on how to brush and sensually touch their feathers, and one of the girls that he uses as an example begins to make happy noises, making the other girls wish that Glenn was touching them all over and doing freaky things to them. After the demonstration, Glenn tells them that he would like to demonstrate his sensual touch on and potentially be inside of another girl. He immediately sees that all the girls want to have him touch them and want him to be inside of them. The girls cannot get enough of him and want to sleep with him, and a very wild adult sleepover party that night as a group.
Wait a minute!
The next day, Safi tells Glenn that they can finally return back to Lindworm now that all of the girls are carrying his seed, and he tells her that they have been away from home, and they better start going before it begins to snow, and they will be stuck. Suddenly, one of the girls flies in through the window and begin to complain to Glenn about what she has seen in the forest while flying that has stuck throughout her body, and Glenn sees that it is more of thread than liquid, and he tells her to go to the hot spring as it can be removed with hot water. This is no problem to Glenn as he is familiar with sticky things on beautiful women. The girl immediately goes out and asks Glenn if he would like to join her in the spring, but Safi tells her to get going as she sees that the doctor is smiling, so she tells him to wipe the smile off his face. Glenn then accidentally places the web on his head and begins to beg Safi to get him hot water. Later that same day, more of the girls return to Glenn to complain about the same problem, and he sees that he needs to get to the bottom of the issue before it gets out of hand. He sets out into the forest with Safi immediately. They begin to head deep into the forest, and they see the webs all over the trees, and they begin to follow it, seeing that it leads them to one of the monsters producing the webs, and tell them to stop leaving their webs around because of the girls. Glenn immediately begins to question Safi about her clothes, seeing that they were made by the very monsters producing the web, and he begins to wonder how her clothes are made. She sees that he has gotten carried away with all the questions he is asking, and she quickly warns him that the monsters are well known for making traps, and he tells Safi that he cannot get caught in any of the traps as he is going to be very careful. Suddenly he steps on one of the traps and is immediately lifted up in the air, making Safi see that they will be notified that something has been caught in their trap by the threads, and she begins to worry. Suddenly, one of them suddenly appears and Safi sees that it is someone she is familiar with, as they have been friends a long time ago. Arania sees Safi and asks her what she is doing deep in the forest, and she tells her that she has come to help the village with the doctor. Arania immediately introduces herself to Glenn and Safi, tells him about her business and her line of work. Glenn immediately asks her what she is looking for in the forest, and she tells him that she is after some phoenix feathers, and she heard that they are common in the village. She tells them that she loves their feathers and would like to use them for her new design, and Glenn mentions Illy to her, and she begins to wonder why she has not been told that Harpy stays in the village. Glenn and Safi then take her to go see the bird, and she begins to chase her around. Suddenly, one of Glenn's friends returns back to him to tell him that she has been caught by the web of Arania when she was chasing Illy, and she is not cool with it. Safi then begins to argue with her, telling her that she is not dangerous, and she is only trying to get something from Illy, and she looks excited and tends to get out of control when she is excited. Glenn then calms them down and tells them that she just needs her feathers for some inspiration. Safi tries to be better and goes into the room as they both see that she is tired. Later that night, Glenn tells her that she needs to take a break, after which she goes to the hot spring to relax a little and consider it as a gift to her. Safi thinks about it for a while, and she sees that she is going to take up the offer. Safi then goes to the hot spring to relax, and while she is away, Arania comes to see the doctor, and she tells Glenn that her head feels fuzzy and her joints are hurting. Glenn then checks her and sees that she is not showing symptoms of fever, and sees that she might be coming down with a cold. She then talks to him for a while about why Safi likes him and all she has heard, and insists that she goes for a walk. He tells her not to stay in the cold for long as she might come down with a cold. Then she asks him if he would like to accompany her if he is worried. Glenn agrees to follow her and suddenly asks her when they will be going back, but he sees that she is not ready to go back. He then decides to escape, but suddenly gets trapped in one of her traps, and he immediately becomes surprised at how and when she set the traps. She tells him that she has set them so that he cannot escape from her, and she begins to tell him how she would like to snatch him away from her friend, as she wants to share him with her. Glenn becomes surprised and tells her that Safi is only his assistant, and they are not dating, and Arania continues to insist on getting him. She then tries to kiss him, but Tlilie comes in and frees him from his bondage, and he begins to thank her for coming to save him. The two girls then begin to argue and talk about how they both love the doctor and how fond they all have gotten with him. Glenn continues to look on and begins to wonder what is going on, and sees that the two girls had suddenly begun to fight each other. He sees that Tlilie constantly keeps mentioning her love for him, and they begin to fight. He begins to wonder what he can do to stop them. Safi immediately shows up with her jealousy and picks him up rudely, not knowing she is strangling him, and she begins to speak to both Arania and Tlilie as he passes out. They immediately take him back to the house, and Safi begins to tell him how much she loves him and how she is always scared that someone will take him away from her. Glenn becomes speechless and surprised and tells her that he loves her back and wants to have another drink with her and then have an adult sleepover. This lightens up her mood a bit as they continue to talk, after which they hear a loud bang, and they go out to see that a huge giant is heading towards their village. The people in the village begin to panic as Tlilie tries to calm them down. She begins to give orders on what should be done to prevent a catastrophic disaster when the giant eventually arrives, as she dismisses everyone to do what they are assigned to do. They begin to pack their belongings, and everyone that can fly begin to move all their belongings away from the mountain, and Glenn immediately finishes treating the last patient as Safi tells him that they should start packing their belongings as well so that they will not be left behind. Glenn looks out the window and sees that Arania is helping out as Safi tell him that she is really good. Suddenly, an earthquake begins, and Safi sees that if they do not leave soon, they will be left alone to fight a giant god. On their way out, Glenn begins to look for Tlilie, as he notices that they have not seen her in a while, and they begin to look for her. Meanwhile, Tlilie has gone back to fight the giant so that the rest of her people can get away. She begins to feel bad for not telling the doctor, but she sees that if she has told him, he would have tried to stop her. She continues to walk and begins to fantasize about everything, and she suddenly sees Safi, and she begins to wonder what she is wearing. Safi tells her that she had told Arania to make it for her before they set out as she feels really cold. She asks her if she was planning to face the giant god alone. Tlilie tells her that it is something she must do as Glenn shows up unannounced. He tells her that he is not surprised about it, making her very amused to see him. Safi and Tlilie begin to argue about either staying to fight the giant god or following the rest of the villagers as they begin to argue intensely. Glenn then interrupts them and tells them that he knows what they can all do. He tells them his plans and tells them that they will face the giant god together as they all agree to the plan and begin to devise a way to bring the giant down. They then notice that the giant is near and they begin to go forth to meet the giant. They arrive at a point where Glenn sees the giant from a distance. He moves closer and tries to find out why she has decided to come down from the mountain, but the girls try to warn him and prevent him from getting close to the giant. Suddenly the giant sneezes and Glenn sees, and this throws him off balance. Her sneezing gushes out a flood of sticky mucus enough to sweep out the whole village as it throws Glenn himself to a far distance. It appears that she has a cold when he checks, and the giant tells them that she had heard that there is a doctor in the village and she would like to be examined. Glenn and Safi are surprised and become speechless. Meanwhile, Illy arrives at Lindworm to tell them the news about the gift, but one of the girls she met tells her that the giant will not harm anyone as her name is Dione. Back at the village, Glenn tells the giant that she has a cold and also has a fever and asks her when she started feeling sick, after which she tells him all that he needs to know, and he promises to make some medications for her. He immediately tries to get off the platform at which he was standing on to attend to her, because she is too huge, and immediately falls on the melons of the goddess. He thanks her for saving him, and she tells him that she is glad that she could help. Glenn immediately squeezes her melons in the bid to get out of the juicy prison, and he sees that they are soft like that of human beings as he begins to fall deeper into the middle of her huge bosoms. Glenn sees that he is going to die if he stays trapped in her literal giant cannons as she tries to bring him out, but he falls back into the freaky massive-sized oblivion. What a lucky son of a. After she gives Glenn enough of her sexy melons, she is given some medicine as she begins to talk to the rest of the girls as they show their empathy towards her. Glenn realizes that she is nice and begins to wonder if the tales about the giants were wrong as he sees that she needs to be given a huge warm cloth so that she can stay warm. Safi has someone who can help them do that as they immediately go to meet Arania, who tells them that it has been her dream to make dresses for a giant. They begin to bring materials which she can use to make the necessary items for the giants as she becomes excited, and tells them that she will not disappoint them as she begins to sew the clothes. Some of the villagers then decide to tend to her hair. Later that day, they see that the clothes and the hair fit the goddess, after which she thanks them. Safi then tells Glenn that they can head back as they need to open the clinic as he follows her, seeing that it is necessary. Later that day, he invites Tlilie out to dinner and tells her to eat as much as she wants as she has been through a lot, and they begin to talk about all that has happened. Safi, who has been watching all day, suddenly begins to comment, telling Tlilie that she likes her courage for standing out to help the village and she admires her because she is beautiful. She immediately tells her that she will not make Glenn fall for her, and they begin to argue. Glenn then tells them that they are both getting along well, and they tell him that they are not, and they begin to laugh. The next day, Glenn goes to honor the invitation of Skady for the Merrywater ceremony, and they notice that Arania was also invited to make costumes for everyone that will be singing in the ceremony, and they become amazed. The ceremony begins, and Safi notices an empty seat and sees that it belongs to one of the misses, and they continue watching the ceremony. The lady begins to give her speech, and they continue to watch. Then they suddenly see that she has passed out, and they become surprised. Glenn and Safi begin to talk about the incident and how he quickly goes to save her and heal her, and they also talk about her personal doctor and how Skady seems to be very honored in the city. They then head to see Lady Tlilie, and they begin to talk. She tells Glenn that he has aged a lot, and they begin to bond again, seeing it has been long they were together. They immediately ask her for the nature of her sickness, as they are told that she is in a very critical condition, and also that she cannot reveal the details to them. She tells them that she does not know the exact cause of the problem, but with some little drugs and nourishment, she will be able to walk and feel better. She then tells them that Skady does not have any interest in getting better, and she tells them that she has said enough and tries to dismiss them. While leaving, they see that the doctor has her hands full as they go to treat someone else in the palace in the bid to assist her. They simultaneously talk about her illness as it appears that there is nothing they can do. Glenn would do anything to save a patient, even if it means disobeying his teacher. He begins to try to find a solution to the mistress problem as they plan on going to her bedchamber. Safi immediately becomes worried and terrified on hearing that Glenn will be going into her bedchamber as she begins to panic. She also sees that he will have to examine her when she is putting on less clothing, and she becomes more worried on hearing that Glenn will be seeing the body of another lady. Safi sees that it is just an examination of the body, and there is nothing to be worried about as he is only doing his job, because he is a doctor, and he has been in and out of patients' houses so many times, and it will not be a problem to her. She still continues to feel uncomfortable, due to several past incidents, as they are given proper information about the situation. They prepare for the evening. Later that night, they arrive at her room and Safi is told that Glenn is the only one allowed to go in. But she refuses and tells her that she will have to go in with him, so as to assist him, but her true intention is to make sure nothing happens because she is jealous and overprotective. She insists that it is only Glenn that can go into the room as he goes into the room while Kunai and Safi wait outside for him and place their ears on the door and begin to wonder what is going on inside. Glenn goes in and sees Lady Skady and goes towards her, after which he then notices that she can actually talk. He tells her that he was sent to examine her. Skady immediately feels bad because she has troubled Kunai also, and she tells Glenn that she is certain that he cannot cure her. Glenn becomes shocked on hearing these words from Skady and watches her as she opens her chest to him. Glenn sees a huge tumor on top of her huge melons and asks her if he can touch it. He begins to rub the tumor at the top of her melons, and she tells him that the tumor is taking over all the veins in her body. She begins to tell him about the Great War while he continues his examination, and he begins to check various parts of her body to see if there is a way that she can be cured of her sickness. He then goes to check her tail and he sees that it is a different color, and he tells her to calm down as he sees that she cannot control herself, seeing that she is making happy noises as he penetrates deep into her.
Oh, shit!
As Skady falls to her knees and begins to cry out of excitement and mixed feelings. Suddenly, Kunai and Safi immediately rush in. They find him in an awkward situation with Skady as they both plan to kill him so he can stop making Safi jealous and insecure, but Skady stops them and tells them that the examination is over as she goes back to her bed to rest. The following day, he goes to see his teacher and he tells her about his plan to save Skady as she asks him if he has convinced Skady to do the surgery and tells him to come back to her if she agrees to it. Glenn then tells his teacher that he will be able to convince Skady to do the surgery, and she asks him why he insists on going so far as she appears to be proud of them since she taught them at the academy. Their teacher then tells them that she needs more hands so that they can perform the surgery, and also gives them a description of a person who is good with their hands and threads. Glenn suddenly remembers someone who is good in this area as they set out to go see Arania. They begin to try to convince her to help them on getting there as she refuses, but Safi tells her that they will be matching uniforms, after which she immediately agrees to the offer. They then begin to plan the remaining activities before the surgery as they plan to also convince Skady.